Hi, everybody. Today is Friday, November 21st, 2025, and our dear friends, our brothers, are here with us. Larry
Well,
Johnson, Carl Wilkerson. Larry is back from Russia. Right now, he's in Florida. And Carl, welcome back.
hey, good to be with you.
Good to be with you. And by the way, on the judge's show the other day, he mentioned you and he said, should he say, dear, 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 dear friend?
uh,
Please subscribe and hit like button, helping us reaching more people. And let me start, Larry, with you. You came from Russia, and you know what's going on there. And we have the new 28-point plan on the part of the Trump administration. They're talking mostly, you look at these points, they have been published. I don't know who published these points. It was the Trump administration or the Zelensky administration. But the most important parts of this agreement, this plan, is that the recognition of Russian annexation of Crimea and four oblasts, and permanent neutrality of Ukraine. And then they're talking about the Russian media getting there in Ukraine. The cap on military size, it's 600,000. That would be the cap for the size of the military in Ukraine, and the election in 100 days. On the part of Russians, we've learned from Peskov and Maria Zakharova, both of them have confirmed that they have received no official document from the
right.
government in the United States. What's your take on what's going on right now?
Yeah. In fact, Pepe Escobar and I were interviewing Maria Wednesday. Let's see, today's Friday. So it was Wednesday. I've lost track of time, along with a fellow named Alexander Kazakov. And she said, the judge asked her, we had the judge on remotely, and he asked her, and she goes, well, we haven't seen anything. We've heard about it. Now, actually, there's a tweet, something out on X by Steve Witkoff. He put it up. Apparently, it was supposed to be a private message only, because once he got it, he went, whoops, got to take that down. He was actually blaming Kirill Dmitriev for it, that Kirill Dmitriev put it up. There's a fellow I've linked to the X account. I'm not sure if he's Ukrainian or Russian, but he posted these 28 points. If that is actually the document they've come up with, and it sounds legit, it's dead. Russians aren't going to go along with that at all. Period. It's done. Example. Hey, we're going to cap off the Ukrainian military at 600,000. Well, Russia and Ukraine reached an agreement tentatively in Istanbul back in March of 2022, at which it was going to be like 85,000. So, and at the time, if you may not recall, but the ground force, the total size of active ground forces on Ukraine's side at the start of the special military operation was about 270,000. So why, in what delusional world does Witkoff and these guys that came up with this agreement think that Russia's going to go, oh, yeah, let's agree to triple the size of the Ukrainian military? I mean, that's assuming they could scrape together 600,000 people. That's a whole nother issue. I would say 50% of what is listed on those 28 points are non-starters from Russia's standpoint. Again, on the territory, yeah, they're going to recognize Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea as Russian territory, but Russia's got a freeze in place in Kherson and Zaporizhia. Freeze in place. They're not going to do that. They're winning. They're moving forward. This thing's only going to end with an unconditional surrender by Ukraine. Russia is not going to settle for anything less. They'll try to keep the lines of communication open, but just yesterday, Putin was with the frontline troops, and he told him, said, look, carry on until we achieve our objectives. Well, one of the key objectives is demilitarization of Ukraine. And that will happen either because the West will finally say, okay, we give up. We're gonna pull the plug. In the United States, Trump can do this today. Pull the plug on support for Ukraine. Stop sending them the money that they are stealing. But no, we won't do that. So Russia's going to finish it militarily. They're going to kill as many Ukrainian soldiers as they need to. They're going to continue to destroy Western soldiers that are inside Ukraine fighting, and they're going to keep destroying NATO equipment. That's how it will end.
Colonel, the size of the Ukrainian military before the war started, it was, if I'm not mistaken, 700,000, 400 active, soldiers and prepared for war, and 300, reservists, if I'm not mistaken. And right now they're talking about 600,000, something similar to what Ukraine was before the war started, and even larger than many other European countries. And how is that possible, in your opinion?
Let me take a little bit different position than Larry just evinced. And let me go back a little bit and start at the beginning of what I would say about it. And that beginning is Alaska. I was dead wrong about, not so wrong about Alaska, but wrong in the general concept of things. And I was very wrong about the call between Sergei Lavrov and Marco Rubio. And let me explain why I say that. Out of Alaska came a more fundamental understanding of some very key issues that had nothing to do with Ukraine, really, except that Ukraine is an obstacle to going to those issues, like the security architecture of Europe, like the nuclear situation, particularly with no treaties, like New START going out in February of 26, and so forth. More progress was made on those issues than was evinced by either side. Then my real mistake was to characterize the call between Lavrov and Rubio as being non-productive, and mainly because of Rubio's obstinance. Au contraire, I'm told, by fairly competent authority, including Sergei Lavrov himself, they actually agreed that they were not ready for Budapest. They were not ready for Budapest, not because the Russians weren't ready. They've been ready for some time. They have all the paraphernalia of working groups, experts, teams, and so forth to do what's necessary to do, particularly to tackle these more serious issues than Ukraine. It was us that weren't ready at all. And so that's what put the kibosh on Budapest the first time around. Now I'm told that cooler heads have prevailed in the administration. I asked the question, name me one. But nonetheless, maybe down in the bowels of the expertise that might still remain at defense and state and other interested parties, they have put together at least a beginning of working teams, the kind of teams you would have for a real effective summit. Teams that can work the details, teams that can take the generalities that come out of the big guys and gals and go to work on the details that will make the agreement work or not work. And that's where they're headed now. And they're headed there with this, so-called plan that Witkoff has leaked or whatever, somebody leaked. And I don't discount the fact that some of the provisions the United States is putting forward are non-negotiable with Russia, but I also don't discount the fact that that's the way you do diplomacy. I'm not attributing that ability to this administration by any stretch of the imagination, but I have to think maybe down in the bowels, some people have prevailed. And there is some method to their madness. So they're not going in thinking that 600,000 will be the deal. They're not going in thinking that Russia will give up this or that in terms of territory gained. They're not going in without the idea that these things, they think, will be used as ammunition to maybe extract a few things out of Russia that might even be extractable, given the situation now, and that won't be too embarrassing for Trump, because otherwise the deal would be extremely embarrassing for him. He steps in finally as the ultimate peacekeeper, and that is essentially what he is. There's no one else that can solve this really in a swift sort of fashion, if we can even use that term, given the length of its duration. But he's the only one who can settle it. And he's the only one who can tell the Europeans to go pound sand, and mean it, and make them go pound sand. So I don't have that negative view of what's coming about, but I don't have any hope really that they will be capable of carrying this out, that maybe the Russians won't get up midstream, as it were, and walk out. I think Larry's absolutely right about that. But I'm willing to suspend my disbelief for a little while and hope that something positive comes out of it. I've lost all faith in Witkoff. He's a scoundrel. So that's not a good thing. I've lost faith in Rubio a long time ago. But as I said, Lavrov sort of dissipated my negativism about that phone call in his description of it. Now, he might have been putting a fine tune on it that wasn't necessarily there in order to move things forward, but he's not usually that kind of diplomat. So I'm a little bit better, a little more optimistic opinion, and I can't believe I'm saying that about anything the Trump administration does.
Well, yeah, let me just add that it's not so much me being negative, but I think Larry, Colonel Wilkerson, for sake of not confusing the listeners, Larry, are you talking about yourself? No. Once this is formally submitted to the Russians, I'm sure that Lavrov and the foreign ministry will say something. Well, we have received an interesting proposal from the United States. It's one that we're going to carefully consider, and then, we'll talk about it. And the point is, out of those 28 things, man, there is a lot to talk about. And there's a lot in there that, frankly, reflects the continued U.S. delusion about Russia. Prime example is number 13. Number 13 on the list says, Russia will be reintegrated into the global economy. The lifting of sanctions will be discussed and agreed upon gradually and on an individual basis. The U.S. will conclude a long-term economic cooperation agreement aimed at mutual development. It goes through all these things that would be beneficial to the U.S. And Russia will be invited to return to the G8. Russia doesn't give two hot damns about getting invited to go back to the G8. Right now, BRICS, the BRICS members, they represent more of the global GDP, and they have a higher economic growth rate than all of the G7 combined. Why would Russia want to join a bunch of losers? That's like saying, we're going to invite you to join the team that finished last in Major League Baseball or NFL football. when you're playing for the championship, you say, thanks for the invite, but no. The other was that point 14. Oh, the Russian frozen assets will be used with $100 billion of it are going to be invested in U.S.-led reconstruction efforts in Ukraine. Oh, yeah, man. Russia's going to be all over that going, yeah, I'll take $100 billion of our money and put it into Ukraine. So that's what I mean. So there are lots of things that are going to have to be discussed. And this means if they get into actual discussions, as Colonel Wilkerson is noting, it's going to be, this is not something that you resolve in a week or 2 weeks. This is, at least a 6-month discussion. Meanwhile, during that 6-month discussion, what we've seen in the last 2 days, Russia is breaking out into Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia. I mean, they're literally, they have punched through the defensive lines of Ukraine. The Ukrainian defensive line is collapsing. So all of this may be moot when they actually get down to saying, do we have an agreement capable of signing?
Nima,
Go on.
Nima,
Go ahead.
let me make a point that reinforces what Larry just said in a different venue, and then another point after that. I just listened to Max Blumenthal tell the judge essentially that Russia and China, in vetoing 2083, I think it was, the nefarious, internationally illegal UN Security Council resolution, Guterres should go bury his head in the sand with regard to Gaza. And why did they veto? And he said, well, they don't want to piss off the United States. Good Lord, have mercy, Max. You're usually smarter than a whip.
Yeah.
Russia and China did not veto because they're looking at the United States destroying itself. Why should they veto a good complement to that destruction?
Yeah, they abstained. Remember, they abstained. They didn't veto.
Yeah. Well, abstained. They did not veto, is what I was saying.
Correct.
And they wouldn't want to do that because they're winning. They're winning astronomically. So why would you want to keep the empire from going further down? And that's exactly what this resolution will do, codifying the slaughter under international auspices in Gaza. And then the second thing I wanted to say is, and I mentioned this too on the judge's show. I didn't have much time, but if you look at anything that might transpire and come to a even remotely successful conclusion with regard to Ukraine, the problem is going to be the Nazis. It doesn't matter who you elect. Well, yeah, it does. Get rid of Zelensky and get back to some kind of electoral process that looks remotely democratic, and you put someone else in there. The people who will violate any kind of agreement that they come to are the Nazis. And they're prolific and many. And Russia will have no incentive to violate anything, but they will have to eradicate the Nazis in order to have any chance of any agreement sustaining itself. So that's a fly in the ointment that I don't think we understand at all. And part of the reason is because we've been using those people. We've been using them all along.
Yeah.
Bandera's our boys. Those Bandera lookalikes, they're all our boys and girls. Just as we did after World War II with Operation Paperclip and some other things, we're using them. And that's going to be very difficult to abate because they won't abate. They will keep on doing what they're doing.
Yeah, and just to reinforce Colonel Wilkerson's point, the West, you know what, and the United States in particular, we've embarked on the strategy of thinking that, you know, we can use insurgencies and subversion to weaken Russia. We tried it in 1999 with what's known now as the Second Chechen War. And, you know, the West does not pay attention to Russia's history. That Second Chechen War was one funded and initiated with significant input from the United States and the Brits, where we were basically taking a lot of the Mujahideen, these Islamic extremists, these Sunnis, out of Afghanistan, integrating them with others from the Caucasus, you know, from the various stands, and then putting them into Chechnya. Now, actually, the Chechens and General Abdi Aludinov made the point with Pepe and I on Wednesday. I had a chance to talk to him as well. He said, look, the Chechens were actually fighting against this outside influence, but it was a bloody affair. It went on 10 years. It was actually Medvedev was president when they ended the fighting. And you think that kind of civil war would leave such a lingering bad taste in the mouth of the people of Chechnya? Not so. Chechnya today is probably one of the most modern of the Russian republics. The mosques are magnificent. They've got, I think, one of the largest, if not the largest mosque in the world, maybe the second largest mosque in the world is in Chechnya. I forget, it's not in Grozny, it's in another location. And what you have are like people like Aludinov in the Akhmat battalions, which are very, very pro-Russian, very patriotic. My point in that is Russia's got a history of dealing with these like neo-Nazis, fanatic, call them whatever you want, that Russia does have a history of dealing with them, of destroying them, and reconstituting society. They've done it. We haven't, but they've actually done it in Chechnya. And I'd use Chechnya as a potential model for what could happen in Ukraine. Because, Colonel Wilkerson's exactly right. These neo-Nazis, man, they're not going away. So if they don't go away, you're gonna either have to capture them or kill them. Russia's very practical when it comes down to that. They would prefer to negotiate and to get them to, put away their hatred. But, the Russians they're not naive. I mean, their history has taught them it's pretty damn dangerous to be naive. So you have to be very practical. And, I think that this, as these negotiations surrounding this possible peace plan go on, Russia is it's going to accelerate. They're going to roll up they'll have control of the Dnieper River from basically Kiev on down. And once you've got control of the east bank of the Dnieper River, you're in a position you strangle any economic possibility for Ukraine. They will have to deal with Russia or they'll die.
Colonel, correct me if I'm mistaken, because to my understanding, when you talk about these sensitive issues, particularly when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine, most of these points that have been mentioned in this document are so sensitive, yet you have to negotiate, you have to talk about them behind the closed doors. And it's a diplomacy, it's not something related to the media. But when you put all of them out, it seems that you're not serious in achieving anything. What is that, in your opinion? Why do they need to publish these points without reaching any agreement with the Russian part?
It's become a major component of American diplomacy. And I have to admit, it goes back a long way. It goes all the way back to Ronald Reagan and even before that. The last president to do things, in my view, furtively, as it were, and to do things successfully was Richard Nixon. And the most prominent place he did that, of course, was with Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong in China. We don't believe in that kind of diplomacy anymore. We believe in being secretive only for a moment or two and using that secretiveness and then the exposure of that secretiveness as a part of our negotiating tactics. We're stupid, in other words. We're probably certainly the world's most incompetent great power at diplomacy. But I think we're the world's most incompetent power, period, at diplomacy. And that's a sad deficit, especially when you're really an empire. But that's the kind of way we do things. And it almost always rebounds to our discredit and our losing. So we have to do other things that are more nefarious in order to try to reverse the situation and win. But in this case, to go back to my original comments, which I said were guarded in terms of being optimistic, this is Trump's particular way of negotiating. And I think Witkoff has proven again and again now, in my original opinion of him, of being an adult at a picnic of idiots, is totally wrong. He's an idiot too, similar to them, maybe a little more polished, but he's an idiot, just like Jared Kushner and the rest of them. They're all interested in money. That's their main thing. They've confused diplomacy with what is stark reality that they have been disregarding for a long time now, arguably ever since, and I'm talking about America, arguably since 2014. And I'd even go back earlier than that to when I was monitoring the Ukraine situation very closely back to 2002. So what does that mean for what we're planning to do now? It means the Russians, as Larry indicated, are going to dominate completely. And are we going to be able to massage that with our leaks and our media contacts and our idiots who go on TV and talk about it to the extent that we can salvage some of Trump's stature as it progresses? I don't know. That may be the most difficult thing to do because we're going to lose, 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 win, lose, 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 win. And the things we win on maybe are the most important things of all. And that's some kind of decent future with regard to nuclear weapons and treaties to monitor them and bringing all the nuclear weapon states into that regime. Not to mention the fact that we need to extend New START, take Putin up on his offer to extend it a year without even any questions, and then work on extending it and expanding it permanently. These are far more serious issues than Ukraine. I hate to say that about people who've died on both sides, but they are far more serious issues than Ukraine, and we need to get to them. And if that's all that comes out of it successfully, then it's a good negotiation. Ukraine be damned. But that's the reality of the whole situation. They're going to win and we're going to lose, and we need to massage the loss. And we have proven of late with the Epstein files in particular as a domestic issue and other things like the situation with Israel that we're not very good at managing loss, especially loss in the media, which damages Donald Trump.
Yeah. Larry, Bloomberg reported that Merz, Macron, and Starmer are teaming up with Zelensky to block key elements of the US plan. And what is the position of Europe today? What do they want from, because as time goes by, it doesn't seem that the Ukrainian case would be that much, a winning card for Europe, because they're losing too much. I don't know how long do they want to continue with that strategy.
Well, what's it called? Is it the term sunk cost fallacy? Once you put all your money in, then you go out and you borrow more money so you can put more money you gamble more money at the casino. That's what Europe is doing.
Reinforcing strategic idiocy.
Yeah. Yeah. That'd be the RSI, when we talk anything involving military, we got to have an acronym, as Colonel Wilkerson will recall. The Russians genuinely believe they see Europe not as a potent military threat, but definitely as somebody, let's call it like a pedophile lurking around a kindergarten that you're going to have to deal with them, and dealing with them, I mean defeat them. They don't want to do that, but as General Aladinov told Pepe and me on Wednesday, he goes, he was basically talking about the acronym FAFO, and he said, well, the French thought it was a good idea to invade us in 1812, and he says in 1814 we paid them a visit in Paris. He said the Germans thought it was a good idea to attack us. We went to Berlin. He said, so if this current group of Europeans persists this way, we'll go where we have to go. We'll do what we need to do because we're going to do everything necessary to protect ourselves. That is the Russian mentality right there. They're not interested in conquering or occupying Europe, but by God, they're not going to let them stand by and continue to threaten and kill Russians, because these European states are doing it. Now, what you have in Europe right now is a tremendous disconnect between the leadership and the public.
Yeah,
I mean, good God. I mean, Merz, Macron, and Starmer, they are their popularity combined doesn't break 50%. If you could take each of their public opinion stance from each country and add them all together, but nonetheless, they will continue to make stupid decisions. However, they're constrained. They don't have an American Express black card. American Express black card means you got like unlimited access to money. You can buy whatever you want. You don't have to worry about paying for it. No, they're broke. and they don't have anybody else standing out there saying, "Hey, we're willing to lend you multiple $1 billion." And while all this is going on, you've got this, the scandal that is gripping Ukraine to an extent of the $100 million fraud. This is a multi-billion-dollar. We're talking at least $48 billion have been stolen and siphoned off. And you back that up with the fact that Europe does not have an industrial base to produce weapons to keep the Ukrainians in the war right now as it is. And they certainly don't have a magical machine that produces soldiers, because that's what Ukraine is running out of right now at a rate they can't replace it. They're losing, in terms of casualties, 40,000 a month killed and wounded. And then add to that at least, and these numbers are not from some pro-Russian source. This is from people like the Institute for the Study of War, very much a pro-Ukrainian outfit, saying that between 20 and 40,000 Ukrainians a month are deserting. They're going, we're not sticking around for this. So you got anywhere between 60 and 80,000 losses on the Ukrainian front. And they're only recruiting 25,000 a month. Do the math. So all of this nonsense coming out of Europe, the Russians have a wary eye at him, and they will punch him in the nose if necessary. But the Russians are focused right now exclusively upon defeating the Ukrainians and by extension NATO. And let me jump back to, why did Russia abstain? As Colonel Wilkerson said, they don't want to give the United States an excuse that if Russia and China had vetoed it, the United States could say, "See, we're trying to get peace. They're blocking peace." They just said, "No, okay, we're not going to stop the United States." But Russia is not in a position where it's going to get militarily involved in either Venezuela or Gaza or Iran until this war with NATO is settled. Once that's out of the way, then they can adjust their foreign policy. But the Russians are smart enough to recognize they don't need to fight a 2 or 3 front war. They're going to take care of business, just like Stalin did in the Great Patriotic War, World War II. They didn't deploy troops to the east to fight the Japanese. They stayed focused on dealing with the Nazis. When they got the Nazis settled, then they told the U.S., "Okay, we'll come help you out with the Japanese."
Colonel, today Peskov was mentioning something important on the part of Russians, which is that the talks that is going on between the United States and Russia is they want to separate the relationship between the United States and Russia from what's going on in Ukraine. They want to talk about Ukraine, but in a separate manner. It's not. But it seems that the United States, Washington, is pushing for just somehow they want to merge the two. But how do you see the situation with Washington? Can they talk separately? The ties, the relationship between the two countries, the two superpowers, they can talk to each other. And separately talking about Ukraine.
Well, it should be the case. They should be able to talk separately about the one and the other. But politics, in particular domestic politics in this country, will make things merge from time to time, particularly as the Democrats begin to realize that they're making headway against Trump. And they are. Day by day, they're making headway against him. And they're even recruiting some of the Republicans to help them. And I don't mean Marjorie Taylor Greene. I mean some other Republicans that are having serious thoughts, particularly in the Senate, about where the country's headed under Trump. And under the Republican Party, they realize that too. But I think Larry's right that the issues that Russia is going to be adamant on are going to foil Trump's attempt in any way to politically capitalize on what happens with regard to Ukraine. And that's a big animal to try and combat, because if Trump feels like the Ukraine side of the equation, if you will, is hurting him dramatically in his chance to get what is he on now? 32nd war, and this would be the 33rd and the most important, that he's the peace bringer in. If he feels like that, that's being complicated. and maybe complicated to an extent that he's not going to get any credit at all. In fact, maybe discredit. Then that's going to complicate the other side. It just has to, the way we work. So I'm worried about what you just said, that you can't separate the two ultimately because of domestic politics for Trump.
Larry, the other thing that the Russians are talking about, that they are behind the scene, they're negotiating with the United States, but the level of negotiations are not that much advanced to achieve anything. It's somehow Donald Trump came out with this 28 point of the plan. It seems that they didn't, share.
Yeah, Donald Trump can't count to 28.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
But who's doing that? If it's not Donald Trump, who's behind the scene doing this?
Well, look, Trump has he's approved the negotiating process, and so the silver lining here, the good news, is the United States at least has come up with some very specific proposals to try. There's been some thinking. This was not just this wasn't a sophomoric attempt. There was some genuine thinking that went into this document. But sorry, I was glancing off to the side, but I just saw the headline on RT. The Kremlin and the foreign ministry both say, we haven't gotten anything yet from the United States. Okay. So I don't know if the leak of this document was intended to sabotage the process. But the point was, the United States at least has prepared a document. And the Russians are very, they love this kind of thing in a way. Give us some specifics and we'll sit down and negotiate. We'll talk it through. We want to go through it, and we'll tell you why that doesn't work for us. And you tell, they're willing to sit down and talk. So that's the positive. The negative of it, as I pointed out earlier, is it's written strictly from a U.S. standpoint of U.S. assumptions about Russia and U.S. Desire to maintain some control over Ukraine and to keep Ukraine in the fight. Because, right now, I don't think the United States is genuinely interested in reaching a solid peace with Russia. Because in the back of our mind, we still got our projects in the Caucasus. We're still trying to destabilize Georgia. We're working hard to get Armenia and Azerbaijan to throw some monkey wrenches in Russia's foreign policy. We're there courting the various stands, the Tajikistans, the Kazakhstans, Turkmenistans. Because why? We want to weaken Russia. That is the ultimate U.S. goal. The United States is not saying, by God, we want Russia to be our best friend. We want to have a critical relationship with them because they've got resources we need, and we want to make sure we'll have a solid friendship. Because Maria Zakharova said on Wednesday as well. She said, "Hey, the only one that's stopping us from having direct flights between Washington and Moscow is Donald Trump and the Trump administration. We're ready to talk about that. How about reopening consulates? How about normalizing diplomatic relations? Russia's willing. Russia's not saying, no, you've got to do this, and then you have to jump through this hoop, and you have to provide. Russia's laying no preconditions on that. Said, hey, let's get back to having normal relations like we did during the Cold War, for God's sake, and then we can talk about these issues. It's the Trump administration that's refusing. And it's not just Trump. It's not fair to just pin it all on him, because if Trump tried to do that, the Democrats and many Republicans would be attacking Donald Trump as a sellout to Putin. So the United States is busy setting itself on fire and then complaining about the fact that we don't have a fire extinguisher.
Yeah.
Which is precisely what empires that are expiring do throughout history.
Colonel, Reuters reported that today, the United States threatens to cut intel weapons to press Ukraine into peace deal. And on the part of Zelensky, I think we have to consider what Zelensky is talking about. Just moments ago, he's saying that they're pushing us toward a difficult choice, either losing dignity or risking the loss of our key sponsor, which is the United States. It seems that Zelensky is in a tough position right now. He has to decide about it. I don't know what's going on in Washington, but they're putting a lot of pressure on Zelensky as well.
I think they've given up on Zelensky, if that's the right phrase to use. A better way to describe it, although bloody minded, is that they wish he'd get out of the way. They wish something would happen to get him out of the way. I'm frankly surprised that we haven't hired Mossad to do it, except that Mossad might object because Mossad is getting things from this too. But at the end of the day, I think we have to have a different leader in Kyiv in order to move forward. I think that's true with regard to Russia, given the statements they've made about not wanting to have Zelensky in the deal. And it's true with regard to us. But you're fighting people like Lindsey Graham and I think Marco Rubio too. I don't know if I mentioned to you what Tucker Carlson said before about, I couldn't believe this when I heard it, but I heard the tape. I think it was Candace Owen that played the tape. When he was actually giving Trump serious advice and Trump was listening to him, apparently in a serious way, they were talking about the vice presidential candidate, and Tucker said, no, you don't want Marco Rubio. And Trump asked him, why do you say I should take Vance and not Marco Rubio? And Tucker said, because they'll assassinate you to get to Marco Rubio. And Lindsey Graham would pay the money for the assassin. So that's kind of the thing you're up against with regard to making some kind of deal with Russia that's strategically palatable and strategically successful. At the same time, you're negating all these people who want to bleed Russia to the last soul, to the last drop of blood. Again, the domestic political situation is going to make it extremely difficult. But Zelensky is going to make it even more difficult if he stays around. So I think he's got to be gotten rid of in some way. I hate to use that expression because somewhat, but he needs to be gotten rid of.
Yeah.
Larry, I really do believe that if Donald Trump is serious in putting pressure on Zelensky, he has to put pressure on the British government and British intelligence because they're behind Zelensky. And do you see anything of that sort happening?
Well, no. I mean, I don't think it's going to happen. It should happen. I actually had I'll be posting an interview either today or tomorrow, one that I did with a former colonel in the Ukrainian GUR who defected to Russia. He admitted he'd become a Russian intelligence asset in about 2015. And he worked for the Russians for 3 years until it, got too hot for him and he had to bail out with his family. But, he said, really, this has been much more of a CIA operation than it has been a British operation. He said, yeah, the Brits are involved, but the CIA was putting its nose under the tent going back to 2005, 2006.
Yeah.
So, Donald Trump's got it. We could tell the agency, you're out, you're done, pull the plug, leave. But, the 20 years, 30 years of investment down the toilet, and the agency might resist that. But it wasn't just confined to this guy's name is Vasily. It wasn't just Vasily's point of view. I heard it from a variety of different Russians that the United States, if they pull the plug and walk away, this thing will be over. It's not going to continue. So they do see the United States as the major antagonist in this entire affair, and yet they'd still like to be friendly with the United States. Why? Because in the back of their mind, they still have what I'll call sort of a 1950s image At least in the United States, it's a Christian nation, and Russians are a Christian nation, even though they've got 140 different ethnic groups, and you got a variety of Muslims. They got one of the largest Muslim populations in the world, at least as a percentage of the population. Hindus, Buddhists, etc. But nonetheless, Russia sees itself as this Christian nation, and sees the United States as something that they are, empathetic with, sympathetic with. At the same time, though, they recognize the corruption that is in the West and the moral decay that is in the West. And frankly, I think the Russians sort of believe that maybe they can help the United States find its way back from this abyss of gender confusion and pedophilia and all these other things that continue to plague us. So it's the United States is the problem, and not so much the Brits. They're a nasty. They're like a nasty little Chihuahua. They say that anybody that's ever had a Chihuahua, and Chihuahua owners will back me up on this. The meaner they are, the longer they live. Okay, you see like a 20-year-old Chihuahua. That's one mean son of a bitch. Okay, so that's sort of the Brits. But the Brits can cause some harm. They're malevolent, but man, they're not the empire power that they were 100 years ago, 150 years ago.
If you want to read a good book, John le Carré's The Tailor of Panama, if you haven't read it. It just gives the Brits everything Larry just described.
Colonel, shifting the gear to what's going on in Venezuela, and we know that so far the USS Gerald Ford carriers, the carrier is there close to Venezuela. B-1s, B-52s, Tomahawk capable destroyers are positioned there. Special operation aviations are rehearsing off Venezuela's coast. And all these together, what is the implication of all these movements on the part of the United States toward Venezuela, and what we're going to see there? And because on the part of Venezuela, we've learned that Maduro was trying to say, I want peace, I don't want war, and he mentioned that over and over. And today he said that we are prepared to fight the United States. What are we going to see in Venezuela? Do you think, are we going to see some sort of attacks, aerial attacks, or are they going to go on the ground fighting Venezuelans?
Let me get my crystal ball.
Yeah.
I think this is just my personal opinion. I've gotten all the facts that I could get my hands on, such as they are these days. But my personal opinion is Trump is just doing this to be doing it. And by that, I mean, he wants to force something to happen that'll be positive, whether it's oil or a different situation with the opposition in Caracas or whatever is irrelevant. He's just doing it because he wants something to come out of it that's positive and will rebound to his credit politically in the United States. And it'll be another war that he didn't start. That sounds facetious until you think it's Donald Trump that's doing this. He's made remarks all along here, and he puts them in at very tactically, even strategic points that indicate he doesn't want a conflict with Venezuela. He doesn't want to use this array of force that he's put out there to do anything untoward towards Venezuela. He wants Maduro to cave, or he wants the opposition to be successful. And so, of course, that's backfiring majorly, because now you have somewhere between 60. I have a student down there in Caracas who used to be at William & Mary, and he's fairly high up in the hierarchy. He was born in Venezuela. What they're doing, in his view, is they're putting 60 to 70% of the portion of Venezuela that might be called a genuine opposition to Maduro on Maduro's side, because they don't like what Trump is doing with regard to their state. And it's understandable that the opposition that is with Trump, the Machados and others, is really very few people in Venezuela now. So the situation in terms of a military operation grows more serious every day if that's true, and you have 90% of Venezuela that's going to oppose it in any way they possibly can. So I don't really think that this is anything more than a show of force designed to extract whatever they can out of Maduro, and then Trump will say, "Well, look what we got," blah 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 blah, and then it'll be declared a success, and off will sail the Gerald Ford and the rest of the military apparatus is there. The thing that worries me, truly worries me, is what the commander of Southern Command made his announcement of early departure about. And the more I parse it and the more I examine it, it's got something to do, if not a lot to do, with the fact that we have passed everything in the United States military that pertains to what I would call paramilitary or direct action in concert with the CIA or whatever, to the Special Operations Command. I saw this happen in Somalia, where we went after Mohammed Farah Aidid and had to ignominiously leave Somalia and Mogadishu because of that. And we didn't tell the conventional force commanders anything about it. I think that's happening now in spades with Venezuela. That is to say, the mothership is down there, the converted cruise ship. All of the soft elements that are attached to that are down there. This includes SEALs, it includes Rangers, it includes Delta, all the really potent soft that the CIA uses from time to time for its direct action. And they are the ones perturbating the situation. He didn't like that, just like our commander in ISAF in Afghanistan and Kabul didn't like that when SOCOM would direct activities in Afghanistan and he would know nothing about them until the Chinook crashed and people were killed. And he would say, "What's going on in my AOR?" I think that's happening big time down there. And so that's a part of the situation that disturbs me, because these people are, in some cases, ashore, already doing things. And they're already doing things kinetically. So this is a recipe, again, for disaster for the empire if we don't shut it down and mind our own business to a certain extent.
Larry, go ahead.
Well, I say, when I teach a firearms class, I don't allow loaded firearms in the classroom, because if you got a loaded gun and you're passing it around, at some point, somebody's likely to do something stupid by putting their finger on the trigger and having a negligent discharge. And the parallel is what we've done we've got all these U.S. forces alerted, armed, primed, and deployed, ready to go. But day after day, I mean, we're now 3 months into this at least. They're out there armed and ready. You can only stay at a high level of alert so long before your capability starts degrading, or people get sloppy. There's going to be something, an accident could happen. And Colonel Wilkerson is right that this Hollywood mythology about special operations forces dominates a lot of our political thinking, and has since 9/11. And look, I've worked with that community, good God, going, now almost 40 years. So I know it inside and out, from apart from the ones that are conventionally known to other units that are what they call SAPs and are black programs, and we don't, the average person doesn't know about them. They've got great capabilities for a very limited number of missions. So you've got the Somali pirates that have taken over the Maersk, Alabama. Yeah, great mission. That's something the SEALs could do and did do, and took it back and, killed the bad guys in that situation. But overthrowing a regime, sorry, they may be able to go in and kill a couple of people. But Delta Force, what's needed in Venezuela, if you're going to do regime change, is a Green Beret mission. And Green Beret are not special operations forces. They're special forces. And one of the things they do different from special operations guys we're black, we're top secret, we can't tell you about ourselves. Whereas the Green Berets are taught, hey, go out and make friends with the locals, eat their food, live with them, dress like them, talk like them, interact with them, be their buddies. I mean, it's a completely different mindset. And that, in fact, you find one of the tensions that existed within Delta Force was early on the try to take more Rangers, because the Rangers have a completely different mindset than do Green Beret. Now there are some soldiers that have both the Green Beret tab and the Ranger tab, but it's still, I don't mean to get so much into the weeds on this, but it's important that people understand how some of these military mindsets work. So I think what Trump's going to come up against is the fact that he can't get a guaranteed success, that if we launch any military operation, it's going to turn out well. It very well could be, the Venezuelans are more militarily capable than the Houthis. They don't have as many long-range missiles, but by God, they've got enough air-to-surface missiles that they can fire from F-16s that could make it a really bad day for U.S. naval forces off the coast. So I think all of this is probably driving towards coming up with what will ultimately be a diplomatic solution. And it wouldn't surprise me to see China and Russia behind the scenes helping, sort of encouraging Trump, showing that he can get a victory. They will establish that there's going to be elections. But as Colonel Wilkerson noted, what Trump's policy so far has done is made Maduro more popular, not less. And in fact, if it goes to an election, he'll be able to say, look, I'm the one that stood up to Trump, and Trump didn't dare take us down militarily because he can't.
Just to reinforce what Larry's talking about, one of the things that made Colin Powell most angry about Operation Just Cause in Panama and the snatch mission against Noriega was a group of special operators. And what they did was they produced the most casualties in a shorter period of time than any other element in the entire invasion force. I mean, they just came online, about 11 of them, and with machine guns blaring, attacked a PDF group. 5 out of the 9, I think, were killed instantly, and 4 others were wounded.
Yeah, that was the air. They tried to take down. It was the Navy SEALs that tried to take down this airfield, which now is actually a shopping mall, if you can believe it. And it was, and I had a buddy of mine that actually worked in the counterterrorism office at the time. He was a Navy SEAL commander, and man, he was livid over the SEAL chain of command that had signed off on this operation, because he said, if your concern is to take out the airplane, Noriega's airplane, put up a C-130 Spectre gunship, blow the hell out of it, and you don't put anybody's life at risk. But no, this one SEAL captain, man, he saw this as his chance to, hey, look what my boys can do, and he put them unnecessarily at risk and got a bunch of them killed, and a couple of them, were turned into quadriplegics. They lost control of their arms and legs and are confined to a wheelchair. Just stupid.
It was almost as bad as the F-117s that Powell tried to keep out of the operation, and Cheney weighed in, and the Congress weighed in, had to put them in it. They went down and dropped bombs on the Comandancia, 2,000-pound satellite-guided bombs. Great success, declared the Air Force afterwards. First use of the F-117s in combat. Well, Michael Gordon for the New York Times went down there with a tape measure and measured the distance from one of the craters to the Comandancia. It was a total miss and a great embarrassment.
Yeah.
Colonel, here is what the former Bush and Trump official, Marshall Billingsley, he said about, his name is Marshall Billingsley, he said about the end game in Venezuela.
Fostered the socialist plague that has spread across Latin America. It's the Venezuelans. It's corrupt, dirty Venezuelan money that underwrote the Petro campaign. They funneled money into Mexico. They funneled money into Brazil. Once we have democracy restored in Venezuela, all of that subversion money that has been underwriting the socialist campaigns around the region dries up. So does the oil revenues to the Cuban regime, all of the support to the Nicaraguans. We forget about what Ortega is doing to the Nicaraguan people. It's a travesty. So the solution begins with a key point here.
Yeah.
He needs to come into the real world. Venezuela and other countries cut off Cuba a long time ago. Otherwise, Cuba wouldn't be the basket case it is with regard to HFO and other things it needs desperately. I'm working with the Melissa hurricane victims right now, and you wouldn't believe how bad the situation is in Santiago de Cuba, for example. And it's largely because of the blockade, but also because of the countries that were helping them have been cut off. And let's look at what Marco Rubio just did in consonance with what this guy just said. He was down there trying to get the presidents of the so-called rightist, in South American definitions, regimes to be on our side to unseat Lula, get him out, get Lula gone, because Lula's a tragic thing for South America. And I guess you know what they told him. And you know what the Ecuadorian people told their leader, who is a rightist and who was going to allow us to come back. They said no by about 60% in a referendum. Bolivia's president, apparently also classified as a rightist, said, no, Lula's an important figure. I do a lot of business with him. Screw you, get out of here. So it didn't work very well. But that's the purpose, and that's what that guy was insinuating with regard to Maduro. No doubt, probably Maduro does send some money around, as do other leaders in South America, the same way we do to try and influence governments all across the face of the globe with regard to politics. But the bottom line of what that guy was saying is he's not plugged in on a timely basis, and he's stupid. And I'd say the same thing about Marco Rubio, who seems to have a vendetta against all Latin American countries, particularly Cuba, upon whose soil he has never set a foot. And our policy with respect to South America and Latin America in general today is abysmal. It's as abysmal as our policies in other places. So the empire strikes out again. And he's a perfect example of how it strikes out and why it strikes out.
Of course, Colonel Wilkerson used a curious word, policy. I wasn't aware that we had any.
Bingo. Bingo.
Yeah.
Larry, what do you make of this the news that is breaking out on X? He's talking about the ex spy Jonathan Pollard. He had a secret meeting with Mike Huckabee at the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem. What is that? What was the meeting about? Because I would argue, because this guy, I don't know if you saw the interviews that the Jonathan Pollard did recently. He was talking about the CIA being against Israel. CIA, He mentioned CIA as one of the enemies of Israel.
Yeah. No, I think Huckabee is talking to Pollard in order to try to defang any of the anti-Zionist crowd that still is somewhere buried in the bureaucracy in the United States intelligence and military community. I mean, Pollard is a loathsome, despicable, and fat human being. I mean, he's just, he's loyal. He's loyal to Israel, not loyal to the United States. But it is what it is. But it just shows, Huckabee's not loyal to the United States either. He's loyal to Israel first and foremost. Yeah, that's the problem. The Zionists. This is one more example of this Zionist crowd. Because remember, Huckabee's not Jewish, but by God, he is an ardent Zionist. And out of this nonsensical Christian crap about, Israel is God's chosen people and the Lord Jesus is going to come back, all that nonsense. It is the foundation for a lot of terrible policies. And yet, here's Huckabee embracing it. So, but it's really created now a split in the Republican Party and the MAGA base that is not going away. If anything, it's as the Zionists tried more desperately to regain control and to quash all these people, the Candace Owens and the Tucker Carlsons, and the Nick Fuentes, all the people speaking out, it's having the exact opposite effect. It's creating more opposition to the Zionists.
Nima, if Trump were smart, right now he'd capitalize on this small victory, but nonetheless a victory, especially given what Larry just said about what's happening within MAGA right now. He'd recall him and fire him.
Yeah.
There was an interview, Colonel, with the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. He mentioned that 3 times Iranian team has reached some sort of agreement with Witkoff, and they came to some sort of solutions 3 times. And whenever Witkoff went back to Washington talking with the people in Washington, he came back and said that that's not possible. In your opinion, who's running the show in Washington toward the case of Iran? Because when Witkoff goes there and agrees on something and they comes back to Washington and says something different, what's your take on that?
I think it's the guy that Tucker Carlson warned Trump about, that he'd be assassinated were he to be the vice president. And not necessarily Marco Rubio himself, though I think that's a big component of it, but the people whom he channels, people like Lindsey Graham and others. We forget, and I was reminded of this many times during the period that we were contemplating the illegal war with Iraq, war of aggression. We have legislation in the Congress of the United States that makes official U.S. policy regime change, going back to the past, in Iraq, and regime change in Iran. And Lindsey Graham was a big part of that. Others in his coterie were. So that's the element that will not rest, just as they are wanting to bleed Russia through Ukraine with even more vehemence. They will not rest until there's regime change in Tehran.
Yeah.
Here is part of the interview that the foreign minister of Iran did with The Economist.
Are in favor of a deal, but a fair and balanced deal. The problem is when Americans, the current administration, talk about a deal, in fact, they want to dictate what they want. And this is what we experienced. As recently as 2 months ago in New York. We are ready for negotiation, but not for dictation. We are ready to go for a deal, but for a fair and balanced deal, not a one-sided deal.
How prepared are you if there were a follow-on Israeli attack on Iran?
We are even more prepared than the previous war.
Can you elaborate? In what way are you prepared?
Our missiles are, in a better position, quantity-wise and quality-wise. We have learned many lessons during the 12-day war. We have learned, we understood our weak points and our points of strength, and Israelis' weak points. We have worked on all of them, and we are fully prepared, even better than the previous time. It doesn't mean that we want war. As the best way to prevent a war is to be prepared for that. Russians helped us a lot during 12 days of war, and after that we have been engaged in more cooperation than before, and this is why I'm telling you that we are even more prepared than previous war.
This is the first time they're talking about, at least I've never heard before, that they're talking about the Iranians, the cooperation between Iranians and Russians during the 12-day war, Larry.
Yeah. Well, in fact, I just saw a report yesterday that Araghchi has had 3 conversations with Lavrov in the last 5 days. So there's something going on behind the scenes. But, and they didn't even mention the Chinese. There's been also a significant uptick in cooperation on the military and diplomatic front between Iran and China. Both Russia and China recognize that Iran is in it's a critical resource, geostrategic resource for both countries, and so they're not going to stand by and watch the West destroy Iran. In fact, they're going to do everything they can to help them. Now, and Iran's got some critical issues right now, particularly with water, and they may have to actually relocate the capital to another part of Iran where they can at least have guaranteed water. It'll be a shift in the national life of the Iranian people, but they're not going to surrender.
It's a long plan, it goes long back. And I remember they were talking about, moving the embassy of oil to the southern part of Iran, to the southwest of Iran. And it's all going, they're planning on it for such a long time. Larry, what is, looking at what the foreign minister of Iran just said, they're prepared to negotiate with the United States, but they're not going to be forced into negotiations, what he was talking about. What is the point for the for the American part, in your opinion? What he's talking about, is that going to resonate for the Trump administration?
You meant that for Colonel Wilkerson, right?
Yeah, I'm talking about Colonel. You, yeah.
The other Larry.
God knows if it's going to resonate with them. But I will tell you this: I was looking at Haaretz this morning, and right in the center, a key story was there will be a war with Iran. And I think that's the critical question right now. And I agree with that. I think before Christmas now, I'll postpone it a bit, unless the situation for Netanyahu politically becomes so dire that he's kicked out. And I'm hearing more and more about the possibilities of that. That discounts, though, that whomever takes over for him will be the same, just a little more low key and maybe not quite as adept at murder. Does that mean that will also waylay this business of attacking Iran? I don't think so. So I think what I'm hearing from Iran too, and you mentioned this the other day, is they're convinced it's coming too. And so I think we're in for a very cataclysmic situation in Southwest Asia, particularly if Bibi uses the nuclear weapon threat against Trump to make Trump come in. And I don't think for a moment he won't do that. I will use a nuclear weapon unless you bail me out. And then all the other incentives that Trump has. And then we're off to the races. I think that's probably the unwinding of the empire in a far more rapid and swift way than I thought otherwise. But I think that's what we're headed for.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Colonel and Larry, for being with us today. Great pleasure to have you both on today.
Hey, let's try to have a cheerier subject next week. All right? Jesus.
What could we suggest to Nima?
Yeah. Hey, I'll suggest beef stroganoff recipes from Russia.
Okay. Hey, okay. Maybe you could come up with some Brazilian recipes, and I'll tell you what an 81-year-old man cooks for himself 4 years after his wife passed away.
Oh, there you go. We'll find out if Nima's can you make a decent feijoada?
Yeah, I would do that for you.
Okay. All right, guys. Thanks.
Thank you so much. See you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.